You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. I am joined in studio by Billy Galanko, and we are recording an episode here before 4th of July that will go live after the 4th of July. So we hope you all had good celebrating if you take part in those festivities. Hopefully trying to acquire some fireworks in Pennsylvania and do some of that.
Yeah, and it's an exciting episode because we've heard people enjoy our banter. So this is just going to be an exclusively Billy and Brady podcast. No guests today.
Yeah, we'll see if it grows our audience or greatly decreases it.
0 listens.
That's right. Yeah. But we have had a few topics we wanted to get to. One, it's kind of relevant to me, or more relevant to me right now because I'm still in the throngs of the middling WSET wine education courses, and so I'm doing level 3 wine and spirits education trust certification, and a lot of it is about tasting, assessing wines for quality, being able to identify wines based on common characteristics of this or that variety or this or that region. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about common descriptors that people use when they talk about wine, and maybe what the average person who doesn't have a lot of wine knowledge or education might mean, and what wine educators or sommeliers mean when they use those same words. I think that's sort of interesting. Words that come to mind, maybe something to start with, maybe is like smooth. You hear that a lot. People talking about a wine being smooth. Do you hear that often?
Yeah, and I think what we want to get into here kind of is more like translating what we think people mean. And I would love, and you're going to get kind of Brady and I's perspective, because I have this weird way that I learned about wine is I literally really didn't drink any wine, and then I became a sommelier. So it's like I never had that interim time where I was just sitting around with buddies or my family. They didn't really drink wine either. So I'd never heard a lot of these terms until after I heard the proper terms. And I'm like, I have no idea what these people are saying. So I want you to help me understand, like, what are people saying? So like when your family says this wine is smooth, are they, can all wines be smooth? Because I was actually at a wine bar last night, and the guy described his favorite types of white wines as smooth and what was the other one? Dry. Just smooth and dry. And I was like, what do you mean?
I think smooth is directly connected to drinkable.
Okay.
And
that.
And when I think of drinkable, I think of like I can just sit there and if you were in college, you could just chug the bottle, and it would be not an uncomfortable experience, right? So, I mean, I think about it kind of akin to whiskey, right? Like a high proof whiskey. You would say it's drinkable if it's not like, burnt, really, really burning.
Yeah.
Maybe, right? So I think the same in wine. If it's not overly tannic, maybe like someone might experience it as either cloying if it's really sweet and syrupy, and they might not like that. That might be something that makes a wine not quote unquote drinkable. It might feel like heavy on the palate in some way. That might not be drinkable to folks. I also hear the word bitter sometimes to describe either high acid white wines at times or like really tannic red wines. I feel like I've heard bitter as a descriptor term. And so I think all of those fit in line with, this isn't really easy to drink. It doesn't go down easily. It makes me wince in one way or another. Something is like standing out flavor-wise.
So in your parlance, there's smooth is what everybody says. Your like halfway translation is drinkable, right? So you're saying what people are. So I think you're, well, I don't know, but I think you're spot on. Kind of from what I was gathering is I think smooth equates to balanced, personally. So like nothing's standing out unobtrusively. There's no high alcohol. There's not weird acid. It's not sweet. It's not, like you said, overly tannic.
Sure.
So I think the translation from smooth to wine talk is just balance, and that's my theory.
I think so, yeah. Just thinking about those things that I was describing is something's maybe like bitter or really acidic, or cloying. Like all those things are kind of very far on one end of their given spectrum. And so I
Hmm.
think, yeah, talking about balance, if you have a wine that's well in balance, the tannins are integrated, all these things are happening. Yeah, I don't think you have those outlier make you wince moments when you're drinking. Yeah, that someone would say is not smooth.
That makes sense.
Um,
Okay,
I
well, let's
think,
talk about dry. What
yeah.
what?
Well, I was just to say one more thing. Maybe also oak in like red wines. So you get some of those oak characteristics, especially in like something that's heavily oaked in American oak, and you may maybe get that like vanilla and those kinds of. I feel like uh, those flavor notes are contribute to the quote unquote drinkability of wine,
Oh,
like the
okay. Well,
monolithic flavors.
all right. Well, let's say go that way then. Do you think that's because well, there's two reasons. Sometimes oak aging, or even like chips or staves and a thing,
Hmm.
um, can impart. It can both. Well, oak aging will soften tannins a little bit. It'll oxidize a
Yep.
little bit. But second, those wines tend to be the ones that go through malolactic fermentation too, which
Hmm.
means they're taking out that malolactic or that not the malic acid and what's left. So that tends and then it gives off I forgot what the enzyme's called, but it gives off that kind of more buttery,
Yep.
milky taste. Do you think that is contributing to this quote unquote smooth and making that kind of a little bit rounder mouthfeel?
Yeah, I think the roundness of the mouthfeel. Yeah, definitely. And I would like if those things are working well. Yeah, I think you could put that under the umbrella of balance, probably too, right?
Yeah, no, 100%.
So
But
yeah.
it's just so interesting because I've heard it, almost everybody says smooth outside of the
Yeah.
like the wine industry, and I've always just been like, if you ever have, whenever I have like the very end of a like a pet nat or some natty wine that's just been sitting on the lees, or not
Hmm.
not even the lees, something that's not been cold stabilized, so you get those tartaric crystals.
Yep.
Like when I drink that and there's chunks almost like pop rocks, to me like this one's not smooth, but every other wine is
This
smooth,
is
and I'm just
rough.
like,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
So
yeah, to simplify it, like you said, I think it's about balance, ultimately, and then for the average person, if they don't drink a lot of wine and they're not maybe used to, highly tannic or like red wines, especially maybe stuff that folks drink here, like these California wines, it might or like overly drying sensation of the tannins. I think that contributes to the ooh, that's not smooth kind of
yeah,
comment.
yeah. Well, that makes sense. I just always thought it was tanniny, so that makes sense. All right, cool. Riddle me what do people mean when they say dry, and what you think common parlance means.
Yeah, well, it could mean a couple different things. It could mean dry, for sure. But I've definitely drank, uh, for instance, like Rieslings or high acid white wines, maybe with some residual sugar that are objectively not dry based on the amount of however many grams of sugar are in whatever wine it is.
Mm.
But people will say, "Oh, like this is nice and dry. I like that." And it's like, okay, that's a cool conversation because then you can say, well, it's actually not dry, based on XYZ technical terms, but that's interesting to talk through. Oh, why do you experience it that way? So I think that dry really can mean actually dry, like we talked about, technically dry in terms of amount of residual sugar. But I think it can also mean someone can describe a wine as dry, even though it has, X whatever grams of RS, but has the acidity to balance it out, and they don't experience it as what they would say, sweet. So yeah, I think it can be something in reality, or it can be something in perception, and people could
And
use it in the same
you've
way.
mentioned before that like you've shared dessert wines that have high acid with folks, and they were like, "Oh wow, this is dry," right?
Yeah, maybe not dessert wines. I don't know. Yeah, so I wouldn't go that far, but I just think like high acid or high acid whites with RS, like maybe like a Riesling or something like that. Um,
Or like what about like a Sancerre,
but
like one of those like late harvests that have high acid though? Like I think those are technically
um,
dessert. I mean, those are dessert wines.
sure, yeah. No, I haven't really tasted that kind of stuff with folks and have heard dry. Yeah, I mean, there's just like way too much perceived sugar in those.
Yeah.
Um,
So my,
yeah,
I think you're right
really
again
mean
too. I
like
think
Trocken Riesling or yeah.
well, Trocken Riesling that literally means dry. Trocken is dry in German. Um,
Yeah, but it still has sugar though, right?
I mean they can technically. I mean, like say for example, like a Grosses Gewächs, which is the highest kind of caliber of German Riesling you can get. Those are produced. This gets really in the weeds, but basically there's a things called Uxlese. Basically it's like the weight of the
Hmm.
must. So like how heavy is the must, and then the must technically with the must is the pre fermentation grape juice. Basically, the heavier it is tends to correlate roughly with how ripe the grapes were. So what they're saying there is there's a really
Hmm.
high restriction for the Grosses Gewächs. So basically, when they're fermenting, sometimes they'll ferment to dryness as far as they can go, and there will be some residual RS just because of how ripe the grapes were to begin with. Um, but for the
Yeah.
most part, if you're having, yeah, I mean, for the most part, a Trocken wine's going to be dry, and there's a big push in Germany to have the dry styles. So like, if you have a Trocken cabinet, it's going to be pretty dry.
Yeah, I thought yeah, I thought that Trocken was more like our off dry. I thought there were like two or three levels even drier than Trocken. Is that not true?
Nah, it's literally a German word for dry.
Oh, okay.
So like,
Yeah,
and then like
sure.
that's what. So they'll say like you'll hear like TBA like Trocken beer and Auslese, like that's basically really late harvest grapes that are fermented as far as they'll go. So sometimes they do use it in the sense like this stopped fermenting naturally. We didn't stop it. Um, that you might hear that, but
So Uber
basically
Trocken doesn't exist, no?
super dry. Oh, maybe no.
That's
Actually,
not.
I
Yeah.
was trying to think of how they describe their sect, their sparkling wines. Now it's
Huh.
not. That's pretty funny though. But I think what you've landed on is something that I've come to the conclusion is dry means acid. Like there's enough acid so it's not cloying, it's
Right.
not flabby. It's
Yep.
basically like this wine refreshes my palate in some way, shape, or form.
Sure. Yeah.
You don't
Yeah.
sound
Yeah, I think so.
convinced.
No,
Okay.
I'm convinced of that. Yeah, I think it's all about. I mean, it's all about acid. I think.
Okay. So we've covered smooth, we've covered dry. What else do people commonly say? And then we'll kind of move on to maybe some blind tasting tips and what you're running into as you're learning.
Yeah, I think I've run across tart and bitter as descriptors recently, and I don't know what to do with bitter.
Hmm.
Like I don't know how to. I maybe I don't actually exactly understand what people are describing, or I don't know what is causing it. Um,
What type of
yeah,
wines do you
so
run into
yeah,
that with?
have you heard bitter and what was it recently? What did we have recently that someone said that? Maybe like a Viognier.
Mm-hmm.
Um, something like really aromatic. What was it that we were drinking? Um, yeah, it's just maybe something more aromatic, um, herbaceous. I don't know if that could lend to saying something like bitter. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So I will say that like Viognier, for example, does have a high level of phenolic bitterness. So like, a little bit of
Mm,
that texture and that bit on the finish. So that might have been what they're getting. Um, I'm trying
yeah.
to think of other good examples. But I see that but I have heard people call high acid wines just like sour or kind of bitter. Of course, like red wines with a decent amount of tannin that's out of balance or hasn't softened yet has also been called bitter. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
Bitter's
Yeah,
a
definitely
little
think it
easier
was
for
a
me.
Conjuro is what we were having, so it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Cool. Well, I think those are a lot of those two are the major ones that I hear all the time, and I'm kind of confused by. So I'm happy we cleared those up. What are you? I can give I guess my top, I guess three or so tips on blind tasting. How are you coming at it now that you're trying to learn how to taste? Like, what takeaways have you gotten so far?
Yeah, I actually haven't started any of the guided tastings for the course that I'm doing right now. I have my first set of samples, but I think for me, because I'm not super good at blind tasting. I'm not great at going from sensory to like verbal description yet, and it's both a skill and I think also something that someone can be just naturally good at or not as good at. So still developing that skill, but I like to practice on white wines. A lot of times I feel like I can identify parts of the wine a little bit easier in whites, which I think I've heard is kind of a pretty common experience. So yeah, starting on whites, kind of cutting my teeth there, and obviously recognizing that trying to take as much from tasting and identifying whites into tasting, identifying, and describing reds as possible, because it just feels like a easier entry point.
Yeah, yeah. I think that all makes sense. I'll share a couple tips that I have. I can say I have never not passed a tasting exam, so I think I'm okay at it. Couple things I think people sometimes, like regular people just trying to think about a wine, they quickly look past. They don't spend long enough looking at the wine, and I'm not talking about necessarily looking at the legs, but just like you can tell a lot by the color of the wine. So whether it's like a white wine,
Yeah.
if it's really light to really dark, that can tell you about its potential age, its potential oak regimen. Same thing with the red wine. If it's really dark, that can give you hints on the grape already. If it's really light and you can see through it, that can also tell you about the grapes. And then looking at the rim, not the rim, but the edge of the wine. They call it like the meniscus. I think that is also interesting. It can tell people like if there's a lot of color variation. Is the meniscus like watery? Does it look really clear? Is it like a clean line that can show it's a little bit a younger wine? So I think that number one, just look at the wine first and try to analyze it that way. Second, I would say when you're nosing the wine, I think Tim Gazer had a bunch of tips, but when you're trying to smell it, obviously make sure you give it a good swirl. But I think I tend to smell in like two phases. Like one, you can do like the primary fruit, or you can really just kind of like what do you get right away, like quick takeaways. And then in my mind, it's always like pulling back a layer or like a blanket. I always picture like a blanket like in a bed. So like I just like looked at a bed and then now I'm gonna get in the bed. And then like there's like a layer underneath where that's where I'd go for like secondaries, like maybe non-fruit like smells and some other things. But you like
Right.
it is a muscle, and if you start training yourself to look for them, like you're like okay cool, I'm looking for fruit now, and you're like your mind can do that, and then you're like all right cool, turn that off, turn on. I'm looking for like mushroom or soil or like minerality, and then you'd be surprised how
Yeah.
much it kind of pops out at you.
I think that's a great tip of before you go in to smell the wine, thinking of what you're expecting, maybe expecting to smell or hoping to identify. So if it's primary fruit, before you kind of dive in, saying, okay, let's see what like the primary fruit characteristic is, versus just, oh, let me smell this, and then you just kind of get hit and overwhelmed with a bunch of different kinds of things. I find it's really hard for my brain to sort out, okay, what's going on if I don't have a plan for what am I hoping to identify on this first pass. I think
Yeah,
that's
because you don't
probably
want to.
the biggest. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to do everything all at once. So like I typically go fruit, like primary fruit, secondary or tertiary notes, and then come back and think about the quality of the fruit. Is it bruised? Is it jammy? Is it, fresh, underripe? And then that way you can kind of like give yourself a break and you're not trying to figure it all out at once. And then you can kind of
Yeah.
circle.
Yeah.
And then something that people have told me on the palate is basically like you should be getting most of the things you're getting on the nose. Like it's rare that the palate's going to be completely different than the nose. But there's when you can add on a couple layers. You tend to maybe get with that retronasal aspiration. Like basically after you swallow when you blow out your nose, you can sometimes get some other notes. Um, and then some of these you can get maybe a little bit more of that minerality. But for me, and I think Tim Gazer mentioned this, and I don't know if the other guy we had on, the other MW talked about it, is like the palate for me is a lot about structure, and that's where you really start diving in, like you were saying, the acid, the tannin, kind of just the mouthfeel in general. That's
Yeah,
what
and
I'm
the
really looking
and the
for.
winemaking, I think you get more there.
Hmm.
You get more of the vineyard there as well.
Any
Um,
faults as well that maybe
sure.
are not evident on the nose. Again, that's all. I guess you would see most on the nose. And then alcohol too. That's also where you're gonna. I mean, you might be able to smell it. You might be able to look at the legs, but that's where you're really gonna be able to get that. And then between all of those pieces, between the acid and the alcohol, the structure, and then what you smelled, you can start narrowing in on where it might be and the color. Because you're never gonna have, or not never. There's never any never. There's absolutes in wine, but if you have a
Hmm.
really dark wine with high alcohol and it tastes, like blackberries, you're not gonna be like, maybe it's from Burgundy.
Sure.
It's just
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. An alcohol tip that an MS gave me one time was to kind of hold the glass progressively, like chest height, like neck kind of height, chin height, and basically, if you can't get alcohol until you get up to your nose, it's probably like 13, 13 and a half. And as you come down, if chest is like 15 plus,
Hmm.
if you're getting alcohol, which isn't like, gonna get it every time, but I think is a decently good calibrator. So,
Something that I think his name is Nick Jackson did mention
that's right.
in
Yep.
his tasting book that I didn't really realize until I was really getting into the diploma tasting was uh, when you're getting serious about blind tasting, swishing red wine like all the way around the mouth, like it's mouthwash, and then swallowing, and then feeling where the tannin is. Only when I did that did I finally understand what people were like. This really like it's the gums where you feel the tannin, or it's like this. Because before I would just keep it kind of in your normal mouth, and it would just cover your tongue, obviously, or maybe the inside. But there are some that really do just like go in your upper and lower gums. Sometimes some literally go around your jaw, and you're like, I don't know why. But then even grapes, same grape, different region, like different part of the world, will do the same thing, and I'm like, I have no idea why. But it's one of those mysteries of wine, which is fun.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I sometimes find if I'm especially tasting like a California cab or maybe something with high alcohol. If I do the kind of swishing around thing, sometimes it can distract me too, because then it feels like, oh, it's just everywhere,
hmm
versus being able to identify like where I'm feeling it the most in terms of like the tannins. But I definitely do resonate a lot with the being able to identify. Oh, do you feel the drying sensation on your cheeks? Is it on your front of your tongue, the back of your tongue, like down the center of your tongue? Those things are helpful. Yeah, I think so.
yeah, you just need to let it go a little bit. But yeah, I guess those would be my main tips. I mean, a high level, I think most people know already. If it's higher acid and lighter color for reds, or higher acid in general for whites, it's probably from a cooler climate. Just because the process of turning, you know, uh, cooler days slows the process overall, so it creates less alcohol, retains more acid. Acid is lost over time as the grape ripens. So I think that's a pretty easy tip. Yeah, I think the steps, if you follow what we just discussed, I think you're in pretty good shape. And then it's really more about just experience, tasting as much as you can, and consciously tasting while you're tasting.
Yeah.
Thinking about what you're actually having in your mouth at the time. That's how I went from not knowing anything really about wine over time to studying and doing the certified, and then growing from there. So
Yeah, and one thing I heard at the seminar that I went to the other week with the neuroscientist talking about olfactory sensing was just like the power of suggestion in tasting wine. If you tell someone that the wine tastes like X, they're going to not only think that it tastes like that, but actually like legitimately perceive, and you can make them perceive that reliably over and over again just by suggesting what it is. So, I think that like wine labels do that, right? And obviously, if you're guiding someone, that can be a training technique, but also something that can potentially get in the way.
yeah, yeah. I still that the tasting notes. I used to write them for my old job. It still boggles my mind, and also like what really boggles my mind is the I guess your library of smells and foods and stuff you grew up with, and how really what you're smelling is through that lens. So somebody, if you've never smelled something, you're not gonna probably get it. But also like different cultures have so many different lenses. So like when I was in Australia, I went to one tasting room and they had one wheel of smells for like tourists from China, and then they had one for like the Australian folks or people coming from the U.S. And it was so
Oh,
interesting
interesting.
because the it was completely different. They had the same colors, but otherwise it was completely different. And um, that's why tasting with Mei, who's grown up in a Taiwanese household, has been really interesting because she's really attuned to some things and will describe something some way, and I'm just like, I don't even know what that is. And then other things, I'm like, didn't you have this growing up? She's like, no, of course I didn't have
Yeah,
that growing
yeah,
up. So
yeah.
yeah, cool. Well, do you want to move on here? What else do we want to? We have a couple things on our list. Do you want to pick the next one?
Yeah, let's talk about wine travel. I saw something the other day. I think that and now I'm gonna mess up. I should have brought up the article, but the first U.S. kind of like producer or family conglomerate, I forget who it was, that purchased vineyards in
It's the Jackson
Essex.
family.
Yeah, the Jackson family. That's right. That's what it was, and hired the Gusborn winemaker to come down and make wine. So we're talking about English sparkling. I guess they're gonna start. I don't know if they'll make still wines or not, but the idea is talking about uh, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, especially being grown in England, southeast, as a result of kind of changing climatic conditions and over the last several decades. But Gooseborn is maybe the most prominent uh, producer of sparkling wine in England right now, and probably also the most widely exported to the U.S. Wine, like the one that you might be able to find most readily on shelves. And yeah, so that the Jackson family has acquired land there and brought over there. Obviously, excellent winemaker to start a project, which I think is cool because I wanted to go there for a while and really interested in the expansion of that market.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's another article out recently saying the vineyard plantings in the UK have grown like 76%, and I think in the last year alone, which is wild. I don't know if that was last year alone, but in recent times. But you bring this up, so you mentioned wine travel, and then you got into these hard facts. I was going to ask you if you could go one place right now for wine travel, where would it be? Would it be the UK or
Yeah,
would it be somewhere
yeah.
else?
For me, it would be England. Yeah, like Sussex, this kind of the Greater Dover area, I guess, right? I
What is
don't know
the
if that's what
draw
they call it or not.
specifically? Weird.
Yeah, I just so I mean I'm familiar with a couple of different projects where like producers down there who are doing just like really small production sparkling. Obviously, there's no distribution to the U.S. There's hardly distribution in the U.K. But yeah, just would be really interested to get down there and visit some of those properties and see what they're working on. Just being that it's so early, the case production is so small. I just think that those are really unique opportunities. Ones that, I mean, we don't really have that too much here in the States. In most of the relevant wine regions, most relevant wine regions, where almost everyone is in the same boat. I mean, by kind of being in early startup days. So
Well, so wine travel though, for me, isn't just about the wine. It's about like, the food, the culture, the place. So what are you interested
sure.
in, like the history or culture? Like, is there something else about England that you're interested in as well? Or is it just like you guys would go pop in, say hi to London and drink some wine and head out? Or what do you look for when you go wine traveling? Like what are your
Yeah,
guys like
it would
big
mainly
things?
be, yeah. I mean, typically food, like you say, like food would be almost a equal part kind of major factor in something like that. But I think I'm just so excited about the wines coming from there that, I don't really care too much about the food or the hospitality or these kinds of things. Although I know that that's all going to get, a lot better over time in like the wine regions there. But just really focused on kind of thinking about, yeah, just waiting to see these projects in their youth. If I'm thinking about culture and food and wine and all those things together, I think the regions that would come to mind that just like are continually recurring and people saying you have to go to Italy. Obviously, any number of places you could go there, but also like Chile, Argentina are two places kind of that are on that list as well, I think. Yeah.
Nice. Well, I've encouraged you because I don't think I have a set idea of where I would go. So if you're gonna let me think here, where it would be for me. I don't know. To your point,
Well, you've just been too.
yeah, no, there's some that I want to go back to. Specifically, like I think I'd like to spend more time in Austria. We went in the middle of winter, in the middle of
Hmm.
a COVID outbreak there, so we couldn't really see anything or do anything. And I still had a ball. Although
Yeah.
me has said she will probably never go back, so I'm like, all right, guess I'm gonna have to figure that one out.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but that's what you get when you go during a COVID lockdown and it's raining the whole time and it's 40 degrees.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I think to your point that when I'm looking, I tend to immerse myself more in the history and the culture and spend a little less. I like so what's interesting about my approach to wine travel is it's not as much always seeing the producers or going to like the domain. It's more like experiencing it around the cities with like the food. Something I do really like. Sometimes I won't even go to the top
Hmm.
producer because they'll have it at like restaurants I really like. So it's like trying to see it, and it's like Habitat where these people have like
Sure.
full lists of all the local producers, and you can have it there, and then you can go taste somebody else that you didn't aren't seeing in the restaurants. Um, so that's what I try to do, and I kind of like to go around the countryside and just like see where like see the vineyards, see like the broader culture of like making there. That was part of what was so cool about driving around Provence is you can just see the vines everywhere. Same with Piemonte when I went last year. But if I had to pick some regions to see, I think it would be kind of a, a driving trip, and I think I would do. I don't know if it was purely for wine, out of wine curiosity. I mean, this might be too much. This might be like four regions at once, so it doesn't count. But I would start in northern Spain,
Hmm.
in Barcelona. I'd drive over. I'd see Priorat because I've always wanted to see it, but there's like nothing there. Like you basically drive an hour and a half in. There's like a small village. I think there's one hotel, according to one of our guests, and then so wouldn't be a lot to do. I'd continue driving west, go over to Rioja, spend a couple days there. I think that area is cool, and then kind of I think I would just probably go up north. I would love to try to fit like Ribera del Duero in there, but I think it's like down and then up. So then I would go over to where like Ria Spices. So go all the way over, make a little stop in San Sebastian, get some Bass cider, go to Ria Spices, and then finish up
Hmm.
in Porto because I've heard the Douro Valley is absolutely beautiful. And those terraces. I just really I'm
Yeah.
in. I just finished the Portugal chapter in my never ending wine book. Where they started building out the terraces in the Douro Valley, and it seems like a huge engineering feat of wine work, and I just really want to see it.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. The kind of hillside vineyards also kind of call to mind wanting to go and visit the Rhone because we skipped. We didn't get down there when we were in France this past time. So something like that. I think also this isn't probably exciting to you, but Santa Cruz Mountains. Want to get
that's
up to
exciting.
Ridge. That's like bucket list in the U.S. Haven't been to Washington State or the Finger Lakes either. So like domestically, those two are kind of on the nearby list.
Yeah, we
Is there anywhere
we
domestically that you are excited about?
uh, I would love to go around some of those Washington State areas,
Hmm.
like in the south there, like Horse Heaven Hills, and see some of that stuff. That's really out there, but I was actually just emailing back and forth with the guys at Troth because I saw that they got a really high score from Decanter, I think 97
That's right.
points or
Yeah.
something. So that was
Nine-
cool. That had me
Yeah, I
had me
think so.
really, and we're going up to Washington this weekend, and it's the wrong side of the state. So I think there, and it's not
Mm.
quite domestic, but the Okanagan Valley up in Canada, I'm also kind of interested in. It's going to be just north of where we are. Um, but I will say Santa Cruz, we considered, or we tossed it around recently as a possible place where we'll have our wedding. We visited two interesting facts. One, Santa Cruz City is like on like the ocean. It's like a surf town. Everybody will see like there's that skate brand with the sticker. everybody knows. But there's like a lot of vineyards on that side, kind of like mountains facing the ocean, and then Ridge is all the way. It's basically in like Cupertino, so it's like a whole range. So it's like it's a wider region you would think. There's like vineyards on the east side and vineyards on the west side, and not as much sprinkled in between. I didn't know that when I went. I thought it was just all one kind of little place. So that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's like Mecca in terms of like bucket list domestic wine for me is to get out there, and it is like a pretty legitimate trip if you're on the East Coast. So
Well, it's also where you have to go down from San Francisco or fly into like San Jose, and
exactly, yeah,
you wouldn't want to necessarily stay right there.
not super direct.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and go on to whiskey. You were just wheeling and dealing, doing some whiskey today. We can talk a little bit about our favorite types of whiskey, maybe, and maybe some travels we've ever done there. Or I think just favorite types would be intriguing.
Sure. Yeah, I'm way more into collecting and tasting American whiskey, bourbon, rye whiskey in the U.S. than I am like Scotch or Japanese whiskeys. I've only had a handful of Japanese and Scotch whiskeys, and I really enjoy them. Just in terms of like accessibility to non-super mainstream stuff, it's just easier to get American bourbons or American whiskeys and bourbons in the U.S. So I've dabbled more there. Go to a lot of kind of allocation drops, which are where liquor stores or governing bodies will release highly allocated assets, and people will line up to get them or win them in lotteries or these kinds of things. And so over time you acquire seconds and thirds of some bottles, and so I was able to do a trade today for a bunch of kind of middling assets and get some better whiskeys. So I traded a few Buffalo Trace products like Eagle Rare and Blanton's for a High West Distillery rye, Midwinter Night's Dram.
Nice.
And my buddy traded some Weller single barrel for some, let's see, did he trade for? Oh, traded some Bookers for some Midwinter Night's Dram as well. So yeah, we kind of are able to trade with folks who are sort of in our vicinity too, who participate in these things, which is fun.
How does this work? Do you guys like have a forum where you're like, we'll meet here and we'll do the drop, or like how does it work?
Yeah. So, well, this particular person we met at one of the allocation drops at one of the liquor stores south of Baltimore, and so I don't know. You're sitting there for like 5 hours waiting for the store to open. So you talk to people. Oh, like I got this. Oh, okay. Like you want to trade. So that's kind of how that goes. And sometimes people will bring bottles of stuff that they have multiples of, and they'll like taste them out of like Dixie cups out of their car. So you can be like, oh yeah, that was really good. Like give me that. Like that's a store pick. So yeah, it's kind of it can be a slimy operation. You got to watch yourself.
Nice.
But no, it was good. I think it got some good value. Been drinking more ryes recently. Maryland, obviously a rye, not obviously, but Maryland is a rye state, has a history of producing high quality rye whiskeys, and there are a few kind of re-emerging and like just flat out newer producers who are making really good rye in Maryland, and so I've been drinking more rye just all the way around recently. Yeah.
Nice. When it comes to American or Canadian whiskeys, I'm more of a rye guy personally. Yep. I think it just has more of a more interesting profile to me, more complex profile, I guess, to me. But that's
no, for sure, definitely does. It's hard for me to identify nuances between bourbon whiskeys. I think it's just owing to the limitations of the particular mash bill, right? Like there's just going to be a lot of overlap between the different bourbons out there based on how it needs to be made. Rye definitely adds more complexity and intrigue, I think, in most whiskeys. So I think that's right.
I think we were able to tell when we were tasting in Kentucky more like the wheated bourbons definitely stood out as well.
Oh,
as
sure.
The heavily rye. Yeah.
That's true too. Yeah. Wheat is, I mean, I tend to like more heavily weeded bourbons. Um, I was talking with someone recently about sort of the idea of how much, like, where's the price point on kind of diminishing returns in terms of value. And I think for whiskey, at least for me, and I really like whiskey and I really like wine, definitely like wine more, but I think especially when you're talking about bourbon, that dollar value is way lower than in wine. So wine, I think that dollar value is like somewhere between $500 and $700, where you just can't justify price above that contributing to like increasing quality. But for whiskeys, I think it's probably somewhere between 125 and 250 or something like that. That obviously could be debated and controversial, but yeah, hard would be really hard to justify that. I've never paid more than 165, I think, for a whiskey.
Retail.
Yeah, retail, right? I mean, I've never paid more than that in like even secondary. You know what I mean, for whiskeys. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's interesting there. I don't. I'm drinking more whiskey. In general, over the years, I've tend to lean more Scotch is my bag, or just things that are kind of finished in. Well, I like Scotch in general, and I like things that are finished. Tend to be in sherry casks, sometimes port casks. A lot of wine finished. I find myself gravitating towards whiskey that tastes more like wine, which I'm like,
Sure.
maybe I should just
Yeah.
keep drinking wine. But yeah, I went to
So
Scotland.
did you like when we went to Angel's Envy? I guess we didn't really talk about it too much, but did you like the port finish stuff that they do?
Yeah, yeah, no, I
Okay.
really like that
Yeah.
one. That was really nice. I thoroughly enjoyed that one. I like that it was in real port casks. When I went to Florida and went to that distillery and tasted their port finish, I did not like it as much because uh, it was not real port, and it was also just like sweet. It was just like sweetness. There
Sure.
was no like
Sure.
complexity added. But yeah, no, I really like that one. I think that was probably my favorite there. Um, in terms of regions in Scotland, when I was there, I fell in love with a couple whiskeys from Campbelltown. Little did I know that it's like the hardest to find, and Springbank was about to blow up and become really expensive, so it's like hard to acquire that. Um, but I just like a lot of the history. So I read a bourbon book, but the history that goes back into the stuff going on in Scotland is so interesting to me. I'm working on, I guess I'll call it a side project, and I just kind of wrote like a long form piece on Campbelltown, and I didn't really realize the whole history. And then, like, as part of that process, I actually got a book from a guy who did a tour of all of what he called all of Ireland and Scotland's distilleries, and like in the early 1880s. And it was all his descriptions of like what they look like, what the whiskeys tasted like, and it was pretty cool to be able to like put that a layer over what we're kind of working with on a daily basis. Um, but I tend to like that and like Highland style, kind of like the lighter, more nuanced whiskeys. And I don't. It's hard for me to describe it. There's like a certain mouthfeel for some of the really heavier. They're not necessarily glycerol wines, but I had this heating pad growing up, and there's something about this mouthfeel that just smells and feels like this heating pad that my dad had. That was like this really old heating pad.
It's just like electric burning, like hot electric.
Electric burn with like it smells kind of like cornmeal is put over like an electric thing. It has like
Oh,
this
sure. Okay. Yeah.
interesting like grain, but kind
I,
of
I
feels
know exactly what you're talking
it
about.
feels fuzzy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just like I'm like So ones that don't have that,
Huh.
but
Have you drank much Japanese whiskey?
a little bit. There that was luckily through there's a place in New York on the Lower East Side that I go every time I go back. And they just have it looks almost like a small jewelry store that's maybe like 30 feet long by like 15 feet wide. And they literally have like little counters, kind of just like a jewelry store would have, but it's just all whiskey. So there then they have whiskey from all over the world. So then I've gotten to do like a bunch of flights. So I've done a few Japanese whiskey flights there, and I get it when I can. But that was nice to be able to let things kind of sit next to each other.
Yeah.
The last time I was there, I had a couple interesting Japanese ones, but one was an American one that was really interesting. I can't remember the producer. It's in the Seattle area, and there's a type of wood up there that you're only allowed to harvest if it's like fallen down. Like you can't cut the trees down to make barrels out of them. Let me look it up real quick. And that was really cool. I think I might have mentioned it on the podcast when I came back because that was um, United States.
So it's like a smaller, like indie producer up there.
Yeah, it's called Quercus Gariana. What is the common name for it though? Um, Westland Distillery. That's the one that I was thinking of. I actually just heard an interview with that guy. Yeah, it's just called Gariana, like Garryana.
Interesting.
It's a native
Seattle. Yeah.
Pacific Northwest oak. Yeah, they're just like transferring ownership. I think the main distiller is moving on. But that was also cool. So it's like that. Those are things that really intrigue me. I like interesting finishes from lighter whiskeys and Scotch, and then I like weird finished or weirdly aged whiskeys. So like this one was really cool. I like things that are aged in Mizunara casks. I had one of those at that same time, which is the native Japanese oak. So I think I'm just kind of a nerd when it comes to like knowing more about the process and what comes out.
Yeah. Here's one that you'd probably like. Have you heard of Sagamore in Maryland? Yeah. So Sagamore, they've been around for a few years, but more emerging, I think, now as they're starting to produce whiskeys. They haven't released them yet. I don't believe it. Maybe next year. Their first kind of Maryland grown rye whiskeys. They've been getting their stuff, but they've done all kinds of different barrel aging programs. And I have a limited release. I think they only did it one time, bottling from they call them like Manhattan casks. So they basically made a Manhattan in a cask, and then use that to age the whiskey. And it's so it's a rye, but it's got all of these like really sweet like red cherry like fruit notes to it. It's really interesting. It's not like anything that I've had, but the rye like holds it together. Like the spiciness of the rye holds all that together really nicely.
Interesting. Sometimes
Yeah,
like I find those can get a little sweet.
it's definitely sweeter. It's definitely sweeter, but I think the rye like helps with to kind of manage that, like hold it up well. But yeah, that I don't like sweet, but it works. It works. So it was a
I
cool project.
wonder. I wonder what really intense whiskey nerds would say about us saying that sweet. Now that we've ended the episode or
For
on the
sure.
back end, we're
Yeah.
probably just like we're saying smooth. I like my whiskey smooth and not
Sure.
sweet.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like big. It's like like cooked cherry is what it's like. Cooked cherry and like hard candy cherry are like
At,
two. Like I get both of those in it.
at the same time.
Yeah, really prominently. So I just like I'm like you, especially with whiskey, since it seems like especially in the U.S. so much of it is very monolithic. I like when there's these really unique kind of aging projects and stuff like that, especially when you can get something that they only did one or two or three barrels of it. That's cool. Single release. So
Yep. Small batch and weirdly
yep.
made are my jams. And not even weirdly made, just small batch. I had last night. I had a Georgian red that was really cool. I think it's only made from like 3 hectares. I love these ones. It's from a region called Kakheti. It's one of the oldest wine regions in the
Yeah.
world. And it's just like this lady just jamming. It's pretty cool, and you can just find these because like you try to look up her website, no website. Her Instagram, like she has like a personal one. That's all it was. It's like it's kind of cool when you just literally these probably just shipped from her garage. So
Yeah, it's awesome.
it's
Yeah,
pretty neat.
my buddies down in South Carolina, Revival, who does the Jimmy Red Corn whiskey. They also made a peach brandy at one time, and then they aged the whiskey in the peach brandy casks. That's a really cool one. That yeah, I'm glad to have that one on my shelf. Just in they only make it every now and then, and it's pretty difficult to like you can't get it from them. I don't think anymore. Pretty difficult to find. And so, I mean, I would buy colored bath water if they put it in a bottle. So it doesn't really matter. But that stuff's really good.
Nice, nice. Well, you're the type of person. There's a thing out here in California, and this is on the same note of like I guess rare or high quality and supposedly better and more expensive.
Mm.
Harry's Berries. Have you ever heard of that on the East Coast?
Harry's berries.
Never heard of it until we moved out here. It's not alcohol. It's just berries, actual
Okay.
berries. Um, and we were walking around yesterday, and
Oh yeah. Okay.
I've forgotten about them. I'm sure I've seen them as I've been out here. And then they were on sale at this. Well, we were at the most expensive grocery store in Los Angeles. There's multiple locations of it. It's called Irwin. So everything there is a little bit more expensive in general.
Mm-hmm.
But the Harry's berries were on sale, like a pound, just like a regular little clamshell tub of strawberries for $18.99.
Oh my gosh.
They're normally $23.99. They were on sale, $5 off, and I was just like, all right, like they look good. These look like quality strawberries, but like what the hell? These are like way more than like the best farmers market strawberries I can pay for. And then he's like, yeah, they're just really good. So it's like half of me was like outraged, but the other half was like, well, they're $5 off. Maybe I should. Like, I gotta try me some Harry's berries. Like, what?
That's crazy.
What's this all about? So,
man, speaking of, I had the best strawberries from Costco the other day. They were crazy. They're they're like hydronically like grown. They're like bright red, big and plump. And I was like, it just blew my mind. They were like $7, I think, but it was also a vat of them, not just a little pint.
Oh yeah.
Costco
Well, nice.
plug. Buy the strawberries. They're in season.
Yeah. Well, if anybody, I guess we need this is the only downside about the Vint podcast not having its own social media, but it would be great to hear from our listeners about what topics they would like us to kind of cover on, or what people are drinking that they find interesting and they would like us to kind of dive in and maybe kind of sneak out and try, because we're always looking for new things to actually get into.
Yeah.
And then as you start to study too.
Yeah, if we don't butcher our audience retention after this episode, we should maybe try and field some audience wine and spirits questions. We can try and move through those.
Yeah. So I mean, we'll speaking of retention here, maybe this will keep everybody. So we do have a big slate of guests coming up in July. I think I'll rattle some off if that's okay with you, Brady, and say with the heavy asterisks that sometimes they reschedule, things happen, so don't kill us if they don't come on. But yeah, so in July we have Karen McNeil coming up, author of the Wine Bible. We have William Kelly of Wine Advocate fame. He's now I think he's the lead reviewer for both Burgundy, Champagne, and Bordeaux, maybe.
Yeah, I got France locked down. I think he does.
Yeah, he was doing some Bordeaux tasting. I know Neil Martin's still out there too, which is really exciting. And then we have Erik Asimov, the famed food and wine critic from New York Times. So those are the three big ones. Those will be being recorded in July, so they'll be trickled out either in July or August. But then mixed in, we have a number of other kind of great guests from all walks of the wine world as we normally do. So it's going to be a exciting, I don't know what you want to call it, Q3.
That's right. Yeah, and as we move on, we have about I think 27 weeks? No, 17 weeks until our 100th episode. So if we are still on air at that point, we hopefully will have some kind of special episode around that time. And here in the coming weeks, stay tuned, because I think we're going to launch sort of a little run-up program with maybe a few giveaways and some fun stuff leading up to our 100th episode. And obviously continue to have great guests on. So appreciate everyone's support. Since we've kind of redone the podcast, the intros, and kind of the format a little bit, also tell everyone to go and follow, subscribe, or like wherever you are listening to the podcast. It actually really does help. I know every podcast does that, but it does help in terms of the algorithm and search and things like that for more people to find the Vint Podcast and tune in. So yeah, give us some ratings, 5 stars only, please. Doesn't help to have to fight with Apple to remove your 1-star reviews when I say something crazy. So appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, all right. Well, I hope everybody had a great 4th of July, and we'll be back next week with another episode and a new interview. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.